Many of those with autism and/or ADHD may be on the hypermobility spectrum and struggle with features of connective tissue disorders like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. The majority of people with these connective tissue disorders also have 1, some kind of dysautonomia, and 2, mast cell disorders like MCAS. These 3 conditions together are usually referred to as the trifecta: EDS, dysautonomia, and MCAS. Most people with a hypermobility-related disorder are going to have some combination of these 3 conditions for reasons that aren't particularly well understood. In this video, I want to explore what exactly is dysautonomia and how it relates to connective tissue disorders and autism and ADHD in general. I'm going to introduce MCAS in a later video, so stay tuned to the channel for more on that one. Now, the nervous system is divided into 2 major parts: the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is basically all the other nerves and nerve endings in your body. That peripheral nervous system is further divided into the somatic branch, which is involved in voluntary control of your muscles, such as skeletal muscle contractions when you throw a ball, as well as the autonomic branch, which I also like to call the automatic branch, because it regulates all the other stuff you're not really in conscious control of and that sort of take care of themselves automatically, like heart rate, digestion, and pupil dilation. The autonomic nervous system is even further subdivided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches. The sympathetic nervous system is colloquially known as your fight or flight branch, and the parasympathetic nervous system as your rest and digest branch. Metaphorically, you can kind of think of them as the gas and brake pedals of your body. Now, dysautonomias, which are also known as autonomic disorders, these are conditions that affect how the autonomic nervous system functions. When the dysautonomia is very apparent at birth, it's usually the result of some kind of rare mutation that's impaired development of the autonomic nervous system somehow. When it rears its head in late childhood, the teenage years, or early to middle adulthood, the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system is usually relatively normal, but it's being dysregulated somehow, usually through another medical condition, or even damaged, as in the case of an autoimmune disorder. Finally, when dysautonomia crops up in older people, it's usually due to a loss of nerve fibers, and it may be associated with other conditions like Parkinson's or diabetes. Now, the versions we're going to focus on here today are the ones that occur in later childhood and early to mid-adulthood. Now, as an aside, if you want to read more about dysautonomia, this is a really good book that I have personally found very helpful. It's called the Dysautonomia Project, and half of it is written for patients and the other half for clinicians. So it is a really useful resource for everyone interested. So check it out. Just again, here that is again. If you want to screenshot that, freeze it and screenshot it, I highly recommend it. Okay. So there are many forms of dysautonomia, but I'm going to focus on the ones that tend to be diagnosed most frequently in association with EDS. And those are postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or sometimes just called POTS, orthostatic hypotension, sometimes referred to as OH, orthostatic intolerance, known as OI, and finally, inappropriate sinus tachycardia, or IST. Now, people with POTS, OH, and OI tend to have most of their problems in relation to body posture. For instance, when they move from a lying to sitting position or from a sitting to standing, their autonomic nervous system may struggle to adapt to the change, resulting in either a racing heart or a big drop in blood pressure, as well as symptoms like dizziness, fainting, tiredness, sweating, nausea, brain fog, shortness of breath, or even heart palpitations. Now, IST is sometimes seen in EDS, and the major difference between IST and POTS is that usually once the person with POTS sits or lays down, their symptoms tend to improve or even go away altogether, whereas someone with IST, their heart will usually continue to race even while reclining. However, someone with IST is still going to experience all the other symptoms like dizziness, heart rates, heart palpitations, etc. It just doesn't tend to be as affected by body posture as we see with POTS, OH, and OI. Now, let's say that your body has experienced some kind of trigger that'll stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. So whether that's something external, like almost getting into a car accident, or something internal, like a sudden drop in blood pressure, okay? Now, what happens? So first off, inside your brain, the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, which is also known as noradrenaline, it's released from a pathway called the locus ceruleus, and it triggers a whole cascade of effects that ultimately causes your adrenal glands that are sitting right on top of your kidneys to dump a bunch of adrenaline into your bloodstream. Now, as an aside, adrenaline is also known as epinephrine, which is what's contained in an EpiPen. Anyways, this adrenaline dump, along with the norepinephrine, leads to a whole host of physiological changes that prepares your body for fight or flight. For instance, both adrenaline and norepinephrine help increase your heart rate, while norepinephrine also works to increase your blood pressure, so blood gets to where it's needing to go more easily. Adrenaline will also cause the bronchioles in your lungs to expand, allowing more airflow. Now, ironically, in dysautonomias, too much norepinephrine can actually cause your bronchioles to subsequently constrict, which is probably why shortness of breath is such a common feature with these conditions. Now, adrenaline will also cause blood vessels to constrict in your extremities, as well as organs like the GI tract, which are areas your body considers non-essential in the short term. Meanwhile, other blood vessels, such as those in the skin and skeletal muscles, dilate, delivering more blood to those regions. In the skin, this helps support sweating and cooling off. In your skeletal muscles, this helps your muscles work at their peak in case you need to fight or flee. For similar reasons, both adrenaline and norepinephrine tell your liver to dump some of its sugar stores into the bloodstream so your cells have plenty of fuel for that fast getaway. Now, all of these physiological signs are potentially completely normal. Everybody's sympathetic nervous system is active on and off throughout the day. Even just the simple act of getting out of bed or having a conversation is going to stimulate any person's sympathetic nervous system at least a little bit. The problem for people who have some kind of dysautonomia is that the normal gas and brake pedal balanced interaction between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems is dysregulated. And to continue with that metaphor, the gas pedal may be getting overused, like you may be flooring it and going 90 miles an hour in what is effectively a 50 mile an hour zone, or alternatively, you may not be using your brake pedal enough. Either way, it's all about the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches, and the bodies of people with dysautonomia are having trouble achieving that balance. Now, why do so many people with EDS have dysautonomia? So one theory is that not only do people with EDS have stretchier skin, they also have stretchier blood vessels, which makes it harder to maintain appropriate blood pressure if your vessels are slightly ballooning out. This lower effective blood pressure may tell your body to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system more so that the heart works harder and increases that blood flow. People with EDS often find that a lot of blood tends to pool in their legs when they're standing or sometimes when they're seated. Now, when your muscle legs contract, they help to squeeze the blood back up towards the heart, allowing the heart not to have to work so hard. But when you're standing or seated, those muscles aren't doing much, and the heart has to work even harder to pump all that blood back up against the force of gravity. So for this reason, standing or even sitting as opposed to walking may be a major trigger for a POTS episode. Compression socks and avoiding longer periods of standing can be helpful measures that help reduce the amount of blood pooling in the lower extremities. POTSies, aka people with POTS, will often increase salt intake as well, since salt causes your body to hold on to more water, and that effectively increases your blood volume and reduces the effects of blood pooling. But just be sure to talk with your doctor before you add in sodium, also for guidance in terms of how much is safe to add, since it can be contraindicated for folks who have higher blood pressure. Now, another possible cause of dysautonomia is related to the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, and this form of dysautonomia is basically known as the hyperandronergic type. Some people with this type of dysautonomia have too much norepinephrine in their bloodstreams, and as you might be able to start figuring out, given what we talked about in terms of norepinephrine and its involvement in the sympathetic nervous system, Too much norepinephrine can lead to chronic overactivation of that sympathetic nervous system. So finally, another possible cause are immune disorders like MCAS, which often produce inflammatory molecules that stimulate that locus ceruleus within the brain in order to release more norepinephrine. Now, neurons in the locus ceruleus have receptors for pro-inflammatory molecules like interleukin-1 and TNF-alpha, and what's more, activity of the vagus nerve that is a major part of the parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and digest branch, that can also be suppressed by these same immune molecules. So I personally see support for this in my own symptoms, since whenever I'm having an MCAS flare, most typically then my POTS symptoms are going to pretty quickly follow suit. There are also some forms of dysautonomia that are recognized as autoimmune disorders. In these instances, the immune system is making autoantibodies, which are antibodies to self. And these are targeting parts of the autonomic nervous system or the blood vessels and the heart. Now, one example is that some people with POTS make autoantibodies to a type of acetylcholine receptor, and acetylcholine is an important neurotransmitter, and that's really, really important for the proper functioning of the parasympathetic rest and digest branch. So if you basically damage those receptors, that parasympathetic branch really isn't going to work too much. And unfortunately, then, that tends to lead to the sympathetic nervous system kind of running amok because you don't have that really all-important balance. Now, as an aside, infection and damage to the cardiovascular and or nervous systems is also likely what triggers POTS and chronic fatigue in people with long COVID. We already know that this coronavirus loves to get inside and damage vascular and neural cells. Presumably, any virus that shows this pattern is likely going to be a risk factor for developing dysautonomia in some folks, unfortunately. Okay, aside from the fact that many folks with autism or ADHD have connective tissue disorders, which in turn increases the likelihood for developing dysautonomia, are these autonomic conditions more common in autism and ADHD in general? Now, there's been a wide variety of research that actually suggests that they are. So, for instance, one article by Bellato and colleagues back in 2022 found that people with autism show hyperarousal as a result of low parasympathetic rest and digest activity during both interesting and boring tasks. So their bodies basically aren't applying the brakes as often as they should. By contrast, people with ADHD tend to show hypoarousal or underarousal during boring tasks as a result of low sympathetic activation. So they're not punching the gas pedal enough. Now, interestingly, people with both autism and ADHD kind of show a combined pattern of hyperarousal during the interesting tasks, so they're not using their brakes enough, and low arousal during uninteresting tasks, not enough gas pedal. So in general, all these people have features of dysautonomia, although the autistic groups share features more in common with the dysautonomias we see associated with EDS, which is namely too little parasympathetic and too much sympathetic activity. Anyways, I hope that you've enjoyed this deep dive into the dysautonomia rabbit hole. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments section. And as always, I'm going to try to do my best to respond. I always feel that's very important. I really do love interacting with the community here. So, anyways, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And until next time, ciao.